And this to the next slide. So in this session, we will have two presentations, one by Ariel Hernandez on key assumptions in the SHAPE narratives, scenarios and models on global and domestic governance, and one by Gabriela Iacobuta on appraising the SHAPE SDPs in terms of the policy mixes that are inherent in them. And then we will have reflections on the governance aspects of the SHAPE scenarios from Julia Leininger, also from IDOS, and Julia is working on broader issues of governance, including the democracy, promotion and peace aspects, and from Déborah García-Luna, who's working for an NGO in Mexico, actually working on gender issues, and I will say a couple of words more later. Yeah, basically the two presentations would be up to 10 minutes, and then we are aiming at 5 minutes comments. And with that, I would basically hand over to Ariel, but I just also want to say thank you all for joining now late in the afternoon, for sticking with us, also sticking with us on a day that is here. We are based in Bonn, one of the high days of street carnival. So thanks a lot for that. Ariel, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ines, for this introduction. So my name is Ariel Hernandez. I am part of the environmental governance team at IDOS, and I cannot believe that the SHAPE project is coming to an end. And at the same time, I'm quite thankful for this opportunity to have worked with colleagues from other disciplines. As mentioned by Bjorn in the morning sessions, linking climate action and sustainable development requires closer interdisciplinary collaboration, particularly between social scientists and modelers. In this presentation, I would like to summarize how we, social scientists, have collaborated with modelers within the SHAPE project, for example, the types or kinds of assumptions, governance assumptions that we contributed in the narratives and scenarios. In addition, we have identified explicit and implicit assumptions on governance and societal organization in the models. And I would like to highlight a few examples of these assumptions and end the presentation by throwing out to the table a few open questions from the governance perspective. You are already familiar with the SHAPE process that consists of the SHAPE Sustainable Development narratives, which reflect the different perspectives on how to pursue sustainable development. We have also the SHAPE models that translate narratives into quantitative scenarios through the modeling protocol. Bjorn mentioned the modeling protocol as a structured qualitative translation of narratives. So in general, the models provide the sustainable development indicators for comparison between the pathways. The SHAPE SDPs explore the pathways to reach the SDGs and the Paris climate target. In the SHAPE project, social science played a key role in the SHAPE process. We have focused on the governance perspective, whereas we assume a broader definition of governance. So we look at the different levels and a wider range of public and private institutions. We also recognize the ability of governance to define normative and or practical agendas. In the SHAPE project, the governance perspective played an important role in the mapping out of the SDGs and the SD strategies for two relevant dimensions, which are the global governance and domestic governance. Domestic governance is also labeled as societal organization to highlight how societies are able to organize themselves. We also supported the aligning of these two dimensions to the overarching scenario narrative. So this is also a joint process with the stakeholders and the modelers. Another joint exercise is the pathway appraisal, which refers to the extent of the feasibility and implementability of the targets in the SDPs. Finally, the governance perspective played a role in translating narratives to the modeling protocol. And in the next slides, I would like to elaborate further on the contributions of governance in the SHAPE narratives, scenarios, and models. Together with the stakeholder co-creation process, we aligned the two dimensions to the overarching scenario narrative. We based most governance assumptions on existing theoretical models and empirical studies. For example, we look at the academic literature on non-state actors and investigated the needed role of the state to allow networks to drive climate and sustainable development actions, for example, in the resilient community scenarios. We'll also look at international relations theories on global society and globalization to support assumptions in the RC scenario. However, I would also like to point out that the governance team of IDOS further expanded these governance assumptions in a discussion paper where we identified the set of institutions and further sociopolitical factors that are more likely needed in each scenario. As expected, there are some relevant sociopolitical aspects relevant to the SDP storylines that cannot be translated directly into model parameters. For some of them, it is possible to use proxies which can be implemented in the model, such as, for example, the amount of international climate financing as one proxy for international collaboration. This is also an example of how social scientific theories, in particular of international relations and political economy, are integrated in the translation from qualitative SDP storylines to the quantitative model assumptions. But there remains SDGs and storyline aspects that are not well reflected in the current generation of models, for example, education or gender inequality. The governance team of the SHAPE project also contributed to the wider academic debate on the improvement of the scientific representation of sociopolitical factors, for example, by co-organizing a panel at the Scenarios Forum in 2022, which brought together leading scholars, both social scientists and modelers. In addition, Julia Leininger from IDOS co-organized a workshop on political futures to follow up on the Scenarios Forum panel. Another contribution of the governance team is to look at the explicit and implicit assumptions on governance and society in the SHAPE models. I would like to highlight the assumptions made by McPie on afforestation as an associated variable on land-based mitigation. In the modern protocol, 3 levels of intervention related to afforestation were identified: high, medium, and low level of intervention. High level of intervention is expected in EI with afforestation following plantation growth curves which might include non-native species. This assumes high carbon sequestration potential through managed plantations. Medium level of intervention is foreseen in MC, where afforestation with native species is linked with a medium carbon sequestration potential. It involves restricted human interference and land availability. And the low level of carbon sequestration through afforestation is expected in RC, where natural regrowth on abandoned land is envisaged. The McPie model has made explicit and implicit assumptions on governance and societal organization. Examples of these assumptions include the presence or absence of management and regulation of species, and this assumption will need to be aligned to the role of the state as regulator, partner, or leader. Another assumption on governance is related to the role of carbon prices, which would most likely signal the type of public or private funding necessary. The presence or absence of financing for afforestation is also an important assumption, and it links to governance questions related to technological innovation. The role of societal norms on land use is also an important assumption that needs to elaborate further, for example, the value of indigenous species and ecosystems. Finally, the assumption on the full implementation and enforcement of policies and intervention is something that needs to be investigated further, especially that policymakers are not able to decree policy change all the time. And policy implementation will also depend on factors such as political will, legal constraints, public trust, or check balance practices in different countries. And after elucidating these assumptions on governance, we have identified considerations and limitations for further scenario development. For example, we need to discuss about resettlement related to afforestation or the livelihood implications and related new inequalities. We also need to understand deeper the land and ownership challenges if land use changes from agriculture to afforestation. And we definitely need to improve our understanding of the interlinkages between afforestation and biodiversity. For example, is the quality of governance or management sufficient to restore biodiversity? What are the tipping points for biodiversity restoration? Or is a society willing to accept biodiversity loss to achieve other priority goals such as food security? And finally, we need to consider the risk and uncertainty in the implementation process. How do we deal with incomplete information or policies or with climate-induced species change? So as you might see, so while the SHAPE project has answered many questions, we also opened up more questions. And I think we need to discuss these questions maybe in the future. And these questions include how we deal with exogenous factors such as pandemics, conflicts, war, geopolitical tensions. We also heard about the debt issue. And then we also need to answer the question or pose the questions, how do we deal with the high level of uncertainty related to SDG interactions and effects and implementation of climate protection and sustainability interventions? For example, how does AI or digitalization play a role to reduce or structure this level of uncertainty? So to what extent do narratives, scenarios, and models provide us a sufficient basis to justify policy making? So how do we communicate these narratives in a way that it is understandable and also that it would induce changes of preference or behavioral change in general? And we also need to ask questions whether to which extent can scenarios assume that they can identify policies that go beyond political ideologies, or do we actually assume that a specific ideology at all? And if yes, is this assumption rectified? And finally, we should ask ourselves, can the SHAPE narratives, scenarios, and models inform the reformulation of the SDGs in 2030? For example, can we contribute to the discussion beyond growth or beyond modern scientism? We heard about this skepticism against pathway thinking. So this would be some questions, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you very much, and back to you, Ines.
Thanks a lot, Ariel. Yes, as in the other sessions, I would like to invite you to already start putting comments into the chat, and we will have the discussion after all inputs as announced. I would then hand over to Gabriela Iacobuta, who's also a senior scientist in the environmental governance group at IDOS. And Gabriela, by the way, happy birthday.
Thank you very much, Ines. Could you tell me if you see presentation mode now, or?
Yes,
yeah?
we see the presentation mode all the time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Oh, but now it's not moving. Okay, there we go. All right, yeah. Thank you everyone for joining us today at this late hour. So I will present to you an appraisal of the SHAPE Sustainable Development Pathways in terms of governance modes and policy mixes. And this is work that I have developed mainly with Ines Dombrowsky, but with a lot of input from modelers and other SHAPE colleagues. So we've been talking about the SDPs, but the question is also how to implement them. And we know that there are lots of different policy instruments out there available to choose from with their own pros and cons. And I will present more of these in the next slide. However, the SDPs have very ambitious goals and also a multitude of goals, which requires a mix of policy instruments. When we put these instruments together, inevitably interactions appear, and these can be positive interactions and also synergistic interactions, but there can also be conflicts and so-called trade-offs between this policy instruments. So when designing policy mixes, it is very important to understand a number of factors that may affect their feasibility. And yeah, this can depend on the cross-interaction between the policy instruments themselves, but also existing path dependencies, the actors involved, ideologies and interests, and the design of the policy instrument. So the objective of this work was to analyze the representation of policy mixes in the model runs for the 3 SHAPE scenarios with a view to governance assumptions within the narratives and the governance modes there. The method was literature review to identify the key policy mix criteria to look at, but we also, of course, the main method was using semi-structured interviews with the modelers and also the different project discussions that we have had. So in terms of policy instruments, these can be characterized by their types, their primary type, which can be economic, regulatory, and information, and you will see some examples on the next slide, and also by their primary purpose, which can be demand pull, technology push, or systemic. Policy mixes, in order to support the SDPs, they will need to address a number of issues. So first of all, they would need to ensure policy coherence in order to avoid conflicts between objectives and instruments. And this can be assessed through the characteristic of consistency of elements in the policy mix. They will need to overcome path dependencies and create new paths. And for that, there would be a need for multiple policy instruments, kind of pulling multiple levers. So there has to be a comprehensive policy mix. But there also is a need for creative destruction to remove existing policies that are not beneficial. They need to ensure that the newly created paths stick through resilience and robustness. They need to ensure that the goals are achieved, of course, so effectiveness is important, but also at the start of the policy mix, credibility is important, and they need to ensure a minimal use of resources, so efficiency is essential there. Due to time limitations, I will mainly look today at policy types and policy purposes in more detail, and also at consistency of elements and credibility in terms of policy mixes. So I told you earlier about the 2 different characteristics of policy instruments, so the primary type and the primary purpose. And the SHAPE scenarios are actually incorporating all types and purposes, but with a focus on the different ones. So EI is particularly addressing technology push, and it's using economic instruments for that purpose. RC focuses on demand pull and uses more information type of instruments, while MC focuses on systemic changes and uses more regulatory instruments. There are also hybrid type of instruments which are designed in a way that combines multiple of these types. Nonetheless, again, as I said, for sustainability transitions, a mix of these policies are required, and what we see in the scenarios is rather tendency towards one or another. So for policy types, what models rely on a lot is setting parameters, a carbon budget or a carbon price, but they are also explicitly showing different policy instruments, for instance, subsidies and taxes, so economic types, standards and bans, regulatory types, behavioral change, which could be done through information, for instance, and innovation type of policies, which could be through systemic changes, as an example. So because the scenarios are including so many different types of policy instruments, it has been possible with the SDPs to have a lower carbon price than in the SSPs, again, by pulling multiple levers. And this has been the lowest in RC and in MC because the demand side is addressed very strongly, for instance, in RC. So to give some examples, in EI, for instance, there are technology price adjustments and taxes, which are economic instruments. These are important policies there. In RC, there are behavioral changes with regard to diets and also with regard to transport. In MC, there's a strong focus on setting higher regulations on energy efficiency measures. To take afforestation as a very specific examples, EI uses commercial trees, MC native species, and RC relies on regrowth. The limitation is that although there are several explicit policy types, they are not enough, they are not fully covered, and that is also a good thing in a way because it allows for flexibility of the type of policies that could be used. But yeah, it also means that there's reliance on implicit assumptions of the narratives. In terms of policy purposes, again, as an example for EI, there is a higher uptake of certain technologies like nuclear, large hydropower, or carbon capture and storage, showing a stronger focus on technology push. In RC, there are stronger lifestyle changes, and we see differences with respect to floor space, number of refrigerators, or the choices of transport. And in MC, this lies in between RC and EI, but we can see stronger regulatory types of instruments and systemic instruments which allow for achieving the highest electrification. So, for instance, how it's land freed up is different. In EI, there's a use of increased land productivity, so technology push. In RC, dietary changes and increased land protection, demand pull, and in MC, combination of both. What happens here, as I said, it's again that there can be an interpretation, but also, yeah, that some of the outcomes that we see could be addressed through policy instruments of different purposes. For instance, when we see efficiency, it could be a regulatory instrument, or it could be due to behavioral changes. In terms of consistency, the SHAPE scenario brought in a lot of value by combining multiple instruments, which allowed to look at all of the SDGs, at least some of them more implicitly than explicitly, but it has a high coverage of multiple interlinkages. And this enables to also better address consistency. So for instance, deforestation, agriculture, biodiversity, and energy use interlinkages are very well reflected now by mixing image, remind, and magpie, and there are other such examples. Trade-offs are important, and they are addressed in the models, for instance, by setting boundaries, adjusting prices on what is not beneficial, or carbon tax revenue recycling. Trade-offs are nonetheless more difficult to address in some scenarios than in others. For instance, in EI, it is harder to meet biodiversity targets. In RC, it is difficult to avoid energy poverty, and in MC, the finance transfers between regions would need to be higher. As a limitation here, as I said, SHAPE has brought in a lot of value by showing more interlinkages, but there are still some limitations remaining. Now, in terms of credibility of policy mixes, SHAPE has also made progress here, for instance, by taking into account regional differences to make more credible portfolios of policies, and also taking into account differences between low-income countries and high-income countries, for instance, in the way that the carbon pricing is reflected, being high from the start in high-income countries and then gradually introduced in developing countries. And also, yeah, the acceptability of certain technologies is then also reflective of how credible that kind of intervention would be in the different scenarios. There are still limitations in that all scenarios require a strong state and an effective state. Also kind of situations such as electoral cycles that might bring in changes or external factors like conflicts, and actors' interests are not fully reflected in the models. And also, yeah, not all policy costs are fully reflected, and also there's not full revenue recycling, so it's not possible to fully assess some of these issues. Now, as key messages, overall, there is a mix of policy types and purposes that is likely needed given the number and the level of ambition of the goals in the SDPs. And there are not so many policy instruments explicitly represented by the models, but through combination with the narratives and the scenarios, I would say that these are rather well reflected. The different governance modes are rather well reflected, with limitations, of course. The models and scenarios reflect different policy mix characteristics that I have listed before. And yeah, importantly, just to emphasize again that all three scenarios will require an effective state, either as a regulator, partner, or leader, as we've seen for the different three scenarios, and also peace in order to put in place and ensure implementation of adequate policy mixes. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gabriela. Yeah, if you can then please unshare. And I would now like to invite our two commentators. First, Julia Leininger. Julia is heading the research program Transformation of Political Orders and Disorders at IDOS.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ines. And thanks a lot to the two presentations, and actually the whole day I learned a lot. It was great to see all the outcomes of the SHAPE project and also listen to the very interesting comments. So what I'd like to do, I have actually 3.5 points, 4 points on like a bit of a broader perspective, and then boiling it down what I think would be next steps to be tackled from a governance perspective in scenario building. So my first impression of the day of the project is that it's a really huge step forward in modeling the SDGs. And I mean, I haven't seen a lot of projects that bring together different elements that used to be apart normally. And this is natural and social sciences, the global and local, but also science and policy. So it's at different levels and actors. So congratulations. My first point refers to this, or the second point, to the three different narratives or pathways, right? And I mean, seeing them on in the different presentations today, I think they do make, I mean, a lot of sense, because they reflect the three dimensions of the world we live in, because we all live in societies, in a state, and in a market, and we experience these dimensions in different occasions with different shapes and strength. When looking at the pathways or narratives, it looks like they're like alternative options. And I would argue, and this, if I got it correctly, is also a basic assumption of the SHAPE project, is that if we agree that we live in a polycentric, multipolar world which faces a systemic complexity, then I would assume that these different pathways play out differently in different areas, right? Because we need different coalitions and different actors to achieve different goals. For instance, we might need a stronger state when it comes to equal food security, and a more regulating state and a strong market when it comes to energy efficiency or the introduction of renewable energy. So I think I don't see these as three alternative pathways, but rather as as some that will play out in different fields differently, which makes it much more complex, of course, but I'm afraid that's the reality we live in. And then it struck me that, I mean, it's not a new discussion, right? That what is the political feasibility? You mentioned that, Gabriela, as well, and how realistic are scenarios? And I came to think that, I mean, scenarios are as realistic as we define them. I mean, whether one simulates or optimizes, it only builds on what we feed the scenarios, right? So theories become much more important now, since from a governance perspective, or the theoretical assumptions. And then I kept thinking, and I might underestimate artificial intelligence here, but I kept thinking maybe there's a world we are still not able to imagine and that we just can't capture from a political perspective. And I can talk about that later, but because of time, I won't go deeper into that. And another point from the theoretical perspective, and at whatever scenarios I look at, these global or national ones, what I really miss is accountability. And this somehow reflects, and here the scenarios are very realistic, it reflects the reality we observe when we look at SDG implementation in the real world. I have a paper out with my colleague Anita Breuer, where we look at all sustainability institutions that were introduced by states to implement the SDGs. It's a big, based on a big data set, and the VNRs, the voluntary national reviews of the UN. And what we find is that accountability is just not in. Neither states implement or have institutions that allow actors to hold their states accountable for SDG implementation. So there's a real lack of accountability, especially horizontal accountability between state institutions and organs. And that's really worrying because, I mean, if there are no institutions that make or allow people to hold governments and other actors accountable, that's problematic for the implementation. And then we get back to the implementation gap that was mentioned several times in the morning. So now next steps, and here I would like to distinguish between global, regional, and national, and I probably have a minute more, Ines, or so. Less than a minute. Okay, so I'll be quick. So on the global level, I think it's a real advancement, the SPAs and also the policy interventions that were integrated now in the SDP scenarios are a real step forward and great. But I'm still missing institutions, right? Political institutions that shape the behavior of actors. And political institutions are long-term, they can be modeled. We do have projections on those. So this, I see that as a next step, but Björn probably can't hear it anymore because we talked about it already very often. Then on a regional level, and that was stressed in the morning as well, and there were some questions in the chat regarding that as well. I mean, we live in an SSP3 world full of conflicts, and assume in the scenarios that the world is much rosier than it is. And the question is, can that be integrated in the models to make them more realistic? And I don't see it on a global level, on global models, but rather on a regional, national level. I think violent conflict should really be considered here. And my last point, and that refers to the two presentations as well. I think here, I mean, on the national level now, the real question is, like somebody asked in the morning, so what do we do with it now? And I think that's the big task now. We have to study countries and regions and look at the policy mixes, the different actor constellation, politics and power, take surveys and look at institutions. So I think that's a really important next step. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Julia. And I will immediately, for the sake of time, hand over to Déborah García-Luna. And Déborah is from the NGO Voluntad
Voluntad Organizada
in Mexico. And Déborah has also been in touch before with the SHAPE models because they were introduced in a training module in a postgraduate program at IDOS in which you participated, the Managing Global Governance Academy. So Déborah, we are very much looking forward to your outside perspective, also given that you are coming from an NGO and activist perspective.
Thank you very much. I feel like I'm the only one in this panel that doesn't come from IDOS, so perhaps I'll have like a very different perspective. But well, for today, I would like to focus on how the regional conditions of Latin America, I come from Mexico, could affect the feasibility or the realization of these scenarios. Now, I am an outsider, so keep that in mind. But I guess I want to kind of start this conversation like painting an image of how Latin America is, which I'm sure kind of everybody knows, but just to make sure we all have like kind of the same level. So there's two macroeconomic aspects that I feel like are key to understand Latin America. The first one is the economic growth, which actually is not bad. I mean, like there was an increase in our gross domestic product, like across all the region. It actually doubled between 1990 and 2014. Like I'm not taking into account 2020, like that makes it a little bit more complicated, but in general, the region is growing. And now, like, although Latin America is not the world poorest region, it is the most unequal. So inequality, while it exists all over the world, it does constitute like a particular difficulty to the fulfillment of the potential in the region. And with that being said, like COVID-19 has aggravated poverty and inequality all over the world, but especially in these countries of Latin America. So just to keep that in mind, and like now let's go through the scenarios. So let's start with economic-driven innovation, which I feel like you're more experts than I am. But I would argue that in Latin America, growth lies in diversifying production, which has always been a theme across Latin America, where usually the balance of trade is kind of in the side of the primary sector, and also in increasing the weight of more technology-intensive sectors in the economy through a big environmental push. Now, like these factors are part of like a progressive structural change that has been happening all over the world, but it has been weak in the economies of Latin America. So we haven't been able to really get there. So I feel like for this scenario, we do need to keep in mind like the links and the interdependence between economic growth and various economic and social aspects, where, as we saw before, like Latin America has a record of increasing its economic growth, but not that economic growth doesn't reach all the society. And that's also true for environmental issues where there's a growth, but then the environmental factors go wrong. So I would say like for this scenario, it's like, unless like this countries build indigenous capacities that are from their own, they won't be able to change their production structures and to protect the environment. And we need to be careful when like applying these scenarios as to not promote growth and unemployment while exacerbating serious social or environmental impacts. So that would be like, I'm being like very general here, but that would be like my overview. Now, I'm gonna skip to the third scenario. I'm gonna talk about the second one last, which is managing global goods. So I feel like everybody in Latin America agrees that the global public goods are essential for achieving the SDGs, the 2030 agenda. This is particularly relevant for environmental issues. However, I do see like, I was trying to think of like issues that could come up. I do see like two threats perhaps for the continuity of this scenario, which I would sum up in two aspects, which is the external vulnerability in Latin America, in the world, and then tensions on the social front. So by external vulnerability, I mean that in order to achieve these scenarios, we would need to reform the international development structure. I do want to say that I come from civil society, so it kind of makes sense with that line of thinking. But I do believe that emerging countries still need greater representation and effective participation in the discussion of how we're managing the global goods and the resulting governing bodies. Like, for example, when you take the international financial architecture, it's governed by a small group of developed countries, and developing countries and the regional agencies play a minor role. And when they do, who is representing them? Is it the people? Is it civil society? Is it politics? Like, who's getting to have a talk there? I also think that Latin America's structure still needs to mature enough to engage in strong regional coordination and cooperation. There are efforts, but yeah, there still needs this maturity. And now by tensions on the social front, I would say, and I'll be very politically correct, there is a lack of a healthy rule of law in general in Latin America. There are some difficulties for the states to control their territory, criminal activity of the political elites. There are massive corruption scandals. So how do we implement this scenario? Who are we trusting? How can we make sure that it's reaching the people that need to be reached? And that leads me to the final scenario, which is resilient communities. Now, this is my favorite one. And I think Ariel will be like, I remember you complaining about this. And I do, but that's what I do. I complain a lot. You can ask my boyfriend there. So there is a tendency in Latin America lately, which I think is great, to include the vision of the people in development processes, especially indigenous and rural communities. Whenever there's a development project, it's kind of becoming more of a participatory process, which from my point of view, as civil society is great. I mean, communities have the wisdom of their environment, which can inform multi-stakeholder decision and change the process from top-bottom decisions to bottom-top decisions. Now, these participatory diagnoses have proven to be great since you listen to the voices of the people and then you make action plans according to their needs instead of imposing a solution that might not fit. And I want to talk briefly, I'll be super quick because I don't know how much time I have, about two projects that happened that I think draw like a really good sense. There was this project that was done in the south of Mexico where there was an indigenous community, and a project arrived and figured out that it was this very patriarchal community where women would have to stay at home, and then they would only go out and walk miles and miles to get water. So then they decided to make like tap water. They made pipes and stuff, and I thought, this is great, we're helping. And then they came back a few years later and all the pipes were like turned apart. But like, by whom? And it turns out it was the same woman, because their only possibility to get out was when they would go get water. So it's the people that know how to reach their development and what they need. So it's important for them to be consulted. There was recently this great project that was done by the government and by several civil society organizations, where they were trying to reach like how to get sustainable tourism. And they did it in 3 different regions across Latin America. And then they started to talk into the voices that weren't usually heard, so women and the youth. And they turned out with this amazing solutions. Turns out they had all the answers. But then there were 2 problems, which is the problem I do see for resilient communities, where now the answers are there, but how do you get to the top? How do you make them listen? And I guess it's only like by giving them more and more power, and it's like a slow process, unfortunately. And then the other one, which is considered by the SHAPE scenarios, is that what was happening in one country was very important for what was happening in the other. Like these solutions, like they could help each other, but there's not good communication. There's not much of like global governance when we're talking about resilient communities. So there is a lack of communication that, I mean, unfortunately, happens when we're talking about giving more power to having a more community-oriented worldview. So anyways, that would be my conclusion. I believe that the resilient communities perspective would be the one that fits Latin America the best. However, as said throughout the whole day, unfortunately, we do need to have a multi-approach for us to reach the SDGs. I do believe that the SHAPE scenarios are doing a very good job. And in general, the 2030 agenda is a historic opportunity for Latin America, since it includes high priority issues for the region, like the eradication of extreme poverty, the reduction of inequality in all its dimensions, economic growth with decent work for all, amongst other things. And I believe that what we're doing today is great. I saw all these statistics and I love them because they're an objective way to see the world. However, we must always remember that behind each statistic, there's a person that is being affected by this different situation. So I want to thank you all for your time, and
Well,
that's all for me. Thank you.
thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Yeah, to all four speakers for the two presentations, and then for Julia and for Déborah on reflecting on what you have been seeing happening in SHAPE. Thanks also for both of you for earthing us a bit. Starting thinking a bit about how does change happen on the ground. And for your reflections on possible ways ahead, Julia. There has been already some reactions in the chat.